A New Year at Greymoor. Chapter 1. Lanterns in the Snow. Greymoor Hall looked as though it had been waiting all year for this moment. Lanterns glowed along the drive, their amber light caught in the fine veil of falling snow. Evergreen garlands framed the stone entrance, and the windows shone warm against the winter dusk, as if the house itself exhaled welcome. Carriages arrived in steady procession. Wheels crunched over frost-hardened gravel, horses steamed and stamped, while footmen leapt down to open doors. Inside, Greymoor was awake in every corner. Fires crackled in grates that were rarely lit all at once. The great hall rang with greetings and the lively confusion of new arrivals. Servants hurried up staircases with trunks and hat-boxes, and the scent of beeswax polish mingled with pine boughs, spiced wine, and roast meat drifting from the kitchen. Someone laughed loudly in the drawing-room, and the sound carried along corridors like music. At the heart of the bustle stood Miss Eleanor Ashcombe, daughter of the house, not so much hosting as conducting. She moved with the quiet assurance of a woman who had always belonged at the centre of things without needing to seize it. Her gown, deep winter blue, was elegant rather than ostentatious, her dark hair arranged simply and her expression calm, as though the entire enterprise of gaiety and company could not disturb her inner balance. Eleanor had learned long ago that a house party tested more than hospitality. It tested patience, judgment, and the ability to smile while two acquaintances attempted to claim the same chair by the fire. Greymoor ran smoothly, because Eleanor knew the subtle art of anticipating trouble before it blossomed, diverting a quarrelsome uncle to the card table, placing an anxious guest near a talkative one, requesting a particular dish for someone recovering from travel. At 26, she had also learned how to endure the other kind of scrutiny of a more personal sort. Because Eleanor was unmarried, not for want of opportunities. Suitors had come in every variety, earnest younger sons with romantic hopes, genial widowers with comfortable estates, ambitious men who had heard rumours of her fortune and believed themselves entitled to it. Over the years, she had declined proposals with consistent courtesy and unwavering firmness, and with each refusal, her reputation had solidified into something both admired and resented. She is proud, some said, as though pride were a flaw. She is cold, others insisted, offended that she did not flutter with gratitude at male attention. Lady Ashcombe, her mother, had once overheard such talk and remarked with surprising steel, "My daughter is not cold, she is careful." Eleanor was careful. She had seen too many marriages formed from need rather than affection. She had watched women surrender their wills for security and men accept convenience in place of tenderness. She did not despise marriage. She despised the version of it that asked a woman to shrink. "If love comes," Eleanor had once told her mother, "it must come honestly. If it does not, I will not invent it to satisfy everyone else." And Lady Ashcombe, warm, sociable, and wise enough to love her daughter as she was, had only kissed her forehead and said, "Then we shall trust time." This New Year house party, however, was time assisted by opportunity. Among the guests was Captain Edward Fairfax, a long-time friend of the Ashcombes, newly returned from the sea with the sort of boisterous good humour that made even winter feel less sharp. He had written ahead, requesting permission to bring a companion. "A fellow who has quite forgotten how to live among people," Fairfax had said in his letter, "and may require rescue." Lady Ashcombe, delighted by novelty and sympathetic to any soul in need of warmth, had agreed at once. Eleanor had scarcely noted the detail until Captain Fairfax arrived that first evening, cheeks ruddy with cold, calling greetings across the great hall as though it were his own. And then he turned, clapped a hand on the shoulder of the man who had stepped down behind him, and boomed, "Come along, Merriweather! If Greymoor can't fix you, nothing will." The gentleman in question followed more slowly. He was tall, lean, dark-haired, dressed with quiet correctness, and wore the unmistakable expression of a man bracing himself for an assault. Not an assault of violence, an assault of company. He paused beneath the arch of the entrance and glanced briefly at the glittering hall, the waiting servants, the laughter spilling from the drawing room. He looked, Eleanor thought, with faint amusement, as though he might prefer to be anywhere else. When Eleanor stepped forward to greet Fairfax, he took her hand with warmth and delight. "Miss Ashcombe, still ruling Greymoor with perfect calm, I see." "Captain Fairfax," Eleanor replied, "you bring weather with you." "Only the best sort, snow and renewal," he laughed, then turned back. "And this is Julian Merriweather, dragged home at last, dragged here with equal difficulty." The gentleman bowed. His gaze met Eleanor's, steady, observant, and undeniably intelligent. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. His voice was low and dry, as though humour lived in it, but had learned to be careful. "You are welcome at Greymoor Hall, Mr. Merriweather." He paused a fraction. "I suspect I have been warned too late what that welcome entails." Eleanor lifted a brow. "We are not so terrible." "I have never been afraid of terrible," he replied, and something in his eyes suggested he meant it. "Only loud." She laughed, quietly, surprised by her own reaction. "Then you will find we are loud with good intentions." "An improvement," he murmured, and followed Fairfax inside. That night, Greymoor's drawing room glittered with candlelight and conversation. Musicians played softly from the corner, card tables were arranged, servants circulated with trays. Eleanor moved among her guests with practiced ease, until she felt, more than saw, Julian Merriweather standing slightly apart, near the tall windows, watching the gaiety with an air of reluctant fascination. She should have left him alone. Instead, she found herself walking closer. "Have you located the nearest exit?" she asked lightly. He turned, and his expression shifted, amusement flickering beneath reserve. "Not yet, but I am considering the window." "It does not open," she said. "Greymoor is designed to prevent flight." "A thoughtful design." "I assure you," Eleanor replied, "we do not hold guests against their will. We only overwhelm them until they cease resisting." His mouth curved. "That seems an efficient system." She could not decide whether she liked him. She only knew she was curious. Chapter 2. Frost, firelight, and a quiet wound. By the second day, Greymoor Hall had settled into the rhythm of a house party. Late breakfasts, brisk walks, afternoons of games and music, evenings of dinners that lingered into long conversation. Gaiety at Greymoor was not constant noise, it was an atmosphere, warmth and movement, a sense of being surrounded by life. Eleanor enjoyed it. She always had, not because she needed attention, but because she liked seeing people at ease. She liked the way the house changed when it was full. She liked how even the snow beyond the windows felt less cold when laughter echoed inside. Still, she discovered something new. She was looking, intermittently, for Julian Merriweather. He did not throw himself into company. He hovered at the edges, listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was with a dry candour that startled those accustomed to polite blandness. Yet he was not rude. He was simply uninterested in pretending. During a morning walk, Fairfax insisted they all go to the frozen lake to skate. Half the party trooped out wrapped in cloaks and scarves, cheeks pink from cold and excitement. Eleanor, gloved and steady-footed, was fastening her skates when she glanced up and found Julian standing a little apart, hands clasped behind his back, watching. "You will not join?" she asked. "I value my bones," he replied. "Your bones will survive. Greymoor has not yet claimed a guest by ice." "That is not reassurance," he said. Eleanor held out a hand. "Then take mine. I promise not to abandon you mid-fall." He hesitated, just long enough to make her think he would refuse, then stepped forward and took her hand. His grip was warm, even through gloves, and his expression remained guarded, but there was something almost grateful in the way he allowed himself to be led. He skated cautiously at first. Eleanor adjusted to his pace without comment, letting him find balance. Fairfax, of course, dashed by shouting something about bravery and the new year. Others laughed and spun, their movements joyous and reckless. Julian did not laugh, but his eyes softened. Later, near the fire, Eleanor found him holding a cup of hot punch, as though it were a lifeline. "You survived," she said. He looked at her over the rim. "Against expectation. Then perhaps you will survive the rest of us." "Perhaps," he said, "if there are not too many surprises." Eleanor was not sure whether the words were warning or hope. Over the next days, the house offered plenty of opportunities for surprise. There was a parlour game that involved drawing ridiculous dares from a bowl, to Fairfax's great delight. A shy cousin was instructed to sing. A pompous baronet was dared to recite a poem, and did so with painful solemnity. Eleanor drew a slip that demanded she speak sincerely about the one thing she would never compromise. She should have laughed it off. Instead, she found herself answering honestly. "I will not give my life to someone who only wants a wife," she said quietly, and the room, usually so quick to chatter, fell briefly still. "I will not be an accessory to a man's comfort. If I marry, it will be because I am loved as myself." A few guests smiled, some looked awkward, and one or two exchanged glances that suggested judgment. Julian Merriweather said nothing, but his gaze held hers a moment longer than politeness required, and Eleanor felt a strange prickle at the base of her throat, something like being truly seen. That evening, after dinner, as guests gathered around music and cards, Eleanor found herself beside Julian near the library door. He nodded toward the drawing room. "Do you always enjoy this?" "The company?" she asked. "The performance," he said. Eleanor considered. "Sometimes it is performance, sometimes it is genuine." "And you?" he asked. "Genuine or performing?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Does it matter?" "It does," he said, and there was such quiet seriousness in it that she stopped teasing. They walked into the library together. The noise of the drawing room softened behind them. Firelight warmed the shelves and the leather spines of books. It was quieter here, intimate in a way the rest of the house could never be. Julian stood by the hearth, hands behind his back again, the posture of a man used to restraint. "You were abroad," Eleanor said, partly because she had heard Fairfax mention it, and partly because she wanted to understand the shape of him. "For years," he replied. "By choice?" A pause. "At first." And then? And then it became easier not to return. Eleanor did not press at once. She understood what it was to hold firm boundaries against others' curiosity. Yet something in his tone suggested he would not be offended by her interest. So she asked softly, "What made it easier?" Julian's gaze moved to the fire. "I was engaged once," he said very quietly. "A foolish boy's certainty. A neat arrangement approved by everyone except, perhaps, the two people in it." Eleanor said nothing. "She was not cruel," he continued. "Not deliberately. She simply realized she did not wish a life with uncertainty. And I was not secure enough to offer anything else." He spoke as if the memory still carried weight. "So you left," Eleanor said gently. He glanced at her, faint irony returning. "As you have already observed, I know how to leave." The words startled her, because she realized he had remembered her earlier jest, and that it had meant something. "I did not mean," she began. "I know," he said, "but it was accurate." Eleanor's chest tightened. "And now you are home?" "Yes." He did not elaborate. She waited. At last he said, "My father died. The estate is mine, And it is in ruins. Eleanor felt a shift in her understanding, as though a portrait had been turned slightly to reveal shadow. I'm sorry. Julian's mouth tightened. It is not grief. Not exactly. It is consequence. And duty, Eleanor said. He looked at her sharply. Yes. Duty. The word sat between them like a third presence. Eleanor understood duty. She lived with it daily. But she also understood what it cost when a person allowed duty to become an excuse to avoid life. She did not say so. Not yet. Because despite his abrasiveness, despite his reserve, she found herself drawn to Julian's honesty. It was not polished. It was not charming. It was real. And that, she realized with faint alarm, was precisely the sort of thing she had always wanted. Chapter 3. The Letter and the Carriage. As New Year's Eve approached, Greymoor grew even gayer. There were sleigh rides over the snowy lanes, the party wrapped in furs and laughter. There was a snowy picnic in the sheltered courtyard, ridiculous and cheerful, with hot soup served in cups to keep fingers warm. There was an evening of charades so absurd it reduced even the most dignified aunt to giggles. Fairfax played the fool with enthusiasm, determined to wring joy from every hour. Eleanor found herself laughing more than she had in months, and she found, too, that she had begun to watch Julian Merriweather for small signs of ease. He did not transform into a boisterous man. He did not become loud. But he softened. He smiled more readily. He spoke with greater warmth. Once, during a late-night conversation near the fire, he laughed, truly laughed, and the sound startled Eleanor so much that she stared at him. "What?" he asked. "You sound different," she said. He looked faintly embarrassed. "I have not done it in some time." "Laughed, felt anything light," he replied, and the honesty of it struck her silent. That afternoon, Eleanor and Julian took a walk along the winter gardens, bare hedges etched with frost, statues half covered in snow. The sky was pale, the air sharp. They spoke of small things at first: Fairfax's ridiculous energy, the upcoming ball, the way the house seemed to glow at night. Then Julian slowed. "I will leave soon," he said. Eleanor's heart gave a strange, sharp lurch. "After the ball?" Julian did not answer at once. "I am not sure I will remain even that long." Eleanor stopped, incredulous. "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because my life is waiting, and it will not wait politely." For the first time, Eleanor felt a flash of anger. "You speak as though you have no choice," she said. "In some matters, I do not." "You always have a choice," Eleanor replied. Julian looked at her then with an expression that was almost pain. "Do you believe that?" he asked softly. Eleanor hesitated. She believed it in theory. She believed it for herself. But she also knew that men like Julian, burdened by estates, by debts, by expectations, often found their choices narrowed by the world. Still, she would not allow him to hide behind inevitability. "I believe," she said, "that fear tells us we have no choice. Duty tells us what must be done, but courage decides how." Julian's gaze held hers, and for a moment, Eleanor felt as though they stood at the edge of something neither of them had expected to approach. Then Julian turned away, and the moment closed like a door gently shut. New Year's Eve dawned bright and cold. Greymoor Hall was full of anticipation, servants moving quickly, florists delivering final greenery for the ballroom, musicians arriving with instrument cases. Yet Eleanor sensed an undercurrent she could not name, a tension in the staff, a hush that rippled through corridors. At breakfast, Captain Fairfax sat beside Eleanor with an expression unusually sober. "Merriweather received a letter," he murmured, leaning closer. From his solicitor. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her teacup. What of it? It's worse than he thought, Fairfax said, and his tone, gentle, reluctant, made Eleanor's stomach drop. He means to leave today. Today, she repeated, as if she had misheard. Before the ball, Fairfax added miserably. He says he must. Eleanor stood too quickly, chair scraping. She managed a polite excuse to the table and left the room with her composure intact. But inside her, something was shaking. She told herself she did not care. She told herself she was foolish to care. But her feet carried her without conscious decision toward the study. Julian was there, standing by the desk, the letter in his hand. His coat was laid across a chair. A leather travelling case lay open on the floor. He looked up when Eleanor entered. "You know," he said quietly. "I do," Eleanor replied, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "You were not going to tell me." "I intended to," he said. "When?" Eleanor asked. "From the carriage." Julian's mouth tightened. "I received the letter less than an hour ago. And yet your things are being packed." "Yes." Eleanor felt pride rise like a shield. "Then I congratulate you on your efficiency," she said coolly. "It seems you have always known how to leave." Julian flinched, just slightly, but enough that she noticed. "You think I take this lightly?" he demanded softly. "I think," Eleanor replied, "that you have done precisely what I feared from the beginning." "And what is that?" "That you retreat the moment feeling requires courage." Silence fell, thick as the snow outside. Julian's gaze dropped to the letter. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I cannot ask anyone to accept my uncertainty," he said. "My estate is threatened, my creditors—" "And so you will choose convenience," Eleanor said, and the words came out sharper than she intended. Julian looked up. "You know nothing of what I am choosing." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Then, enlighten me." Julian's jaw worked, as though he wrestled with words he did not want to give. "There is," he stopped. "There is an expectation, a path laid before me, a marriage that would solve everything." Eleanor stared. It was one thing to suspect obligations. It was another to hear it spoken aloud. "So you leave Greymoor," she said slowly, "because you must go and make an arrangement." Julian's expression tightened with something like shame. "I leave because my solicitor demands my presence, and because my estate cannot be saved by sentiment." "And what of truth?" Eleanor asked, and her voice trembled despite her effort. "What of the thing you have been so unwillingly honest about with me?" Julian's eyes held hers. "I did not come intending to love you," he said, and though he meant it as confession, it landed like rejection. Eleanor's pride snapped into place. "Then go," she said quietly, "and do not mistake regret for responsibility." Julian stepped forward as if to reach for her, then stopped, hands curling into fists. "Eleanor." But she was already turning away. If she stayed another moment, she might say something she could not forgive herself for saying. Or worse, she might beg him to stay. She left the study with her chin lifted and her heart wounded in a way she had spent years believing impossible. That afternoon, Eleanor moved through the house as though in a dream. She smiled when spoken to, gave instructions when needed, answered questions about the evening's ball. Only Lady Ashcombe, watching her daughter with a mother's sharp perception, seemed to sense the strain beneath the surface. And then, as dusk fell, Eleanor saw through the window a familiar figure at the front steps, Julian, coat on, a travelling bag in hand. A carriage waited. The sight struck her like a physical blow. So it was true. He was leaving. The world did not tilt. The house did not stop. Guests continued laughing in the drawing room. Somewhere, a maid carried candles up the stairs. Only Eleanor's certainty that she would never be foolish enough to feel deeply shattered entirely. Chapter 4. The Staying and the Asking. Julian Merriweather stood at the edge of Greymoor's drive, the carriage waiting, the horses steaming in the cold. The driver held the reins, glancing back with the weary patience of a man accustomed to last-minute changes. Julian could leave. The letter in his pocket demanded it. The obligations waiting at home demanded it. The path of convenience was open and clear. Yet his body refused to move. Eleanor's face, proud, hurt, composed, was lodged in his mind with painful clarity. So was her voice. I will not be an accessory to a man's comfort. He realized something with sudden sharpness. If he left now, he would become exactly the sort of man she had sworn never to marry, a man who chose safety over truth. And he could not bear the thought. Not because he wanted her fortune or her position or her home, but because he had discovered, too late and too quickly, that he wanted her respect more than he wanted ease. He turned to the driver. "You may go," he said. The driver blinked. "Sir?" Julian's voice was steady. "I will not require the carriage." A moment later, he was walking back toward the house, boots crunching through snow, each step feeling like a decision, sharp, clear, irrevocable. Inside, the hall was bright with lamplight. Servants moved around him, startled. Julian did not pause. He asked for Lord Ashcombe at once. Lord and Lady Ashcombe received him in the morning room. The fire glowed warmly. Outside, the windows reflected winter twilight. Julian bowed. "My lord." "Lady Ashcombe." His voice tightened for a moment, then steadied. "I intended to depart this evening." Lady Ashcombe's gaze sharpened. Captain Fairfax mentioned urgent news. "Yes," Julian replied. He did not evade. "My estate is burdened. My solicitor demands my presence, and there is an expectation, an arrangement, that would solve my difficulties quickly." Lord Ashcombe regarded him gravely. "And you intend to pursue it?" Julian drew a breath. "I intended to," he admitted, "because it seemed the sensible course. But I have realized that leaving now would be cowardice disguised as prudence." Silence. Julian continued, forcing himself to be utterly honest. "Your daughter has, quite against my will, become someone I cannot dismiss from my thoughts. I do not speak lightly. I do not speak impulsively. I speak as a man who has avoided attachment for years because he feared being made foolish by it." Lady Ashcombe watched him without blinking. Julian's hands tightened behind his back. "I will not ask for Eleanor's hand while my affairs are unsettled. I will not ask her to accept uncertainty. But I wish to tell you what I feel and how I mean to proceed." Lord Ashcombe's expression remained stern. "Proceed, then." "I will resolve my estate honourably," Julian said, "without trading my freedom, or hers, for convenience. If I must sell land, I will. If I must live more modestly, I will. But I will not bind myself to a marriage of rescue. And I will not—" His voice caught slightly. "Walk away from something true merely because it is difficult." Lady Ashcombe leaned forward, her eyes bright with a softness Julian did not expect. "You have spoken to us before you have spoken to Eleanor." Julian nodded. "It is proper." "And it is rare," she said quietly. Lord Ashcombe's gaze remained fixed. "You may find my daughter difficult to persuade." Julian's mouth tightened with something like admiration. "I know." "And if she refuses you?" Lord Ashcombe asked. Julian did not flinch. "Then she will remain exactly what she is now, free, and I will still do what I have said, because it is right, not because it wins me anything." There was a pause that seemed to stretch. Then Lady Ashcombe said softly, "The ball begins in an hour." Julian met her gaze. "And you may stay," she added, as if granting permission for more than mere attendance. Lord Ashcombe exhaled, the sternness in his face easing by a fraction. "Very well, Mr. Merriweather. Stay, and speak to my daughter, with honour." Julian bowed again, feeling as though he had stepped through a threshold from which there was no retreat. Upstairs, Eleanor prepared for the ball, with hands that were steady only because she demanded steadiness from them. Her maid fastened her hair, pinned pearls at her throat, smoothed the ivory silk of her gown. Eleanor watched her own reflection, expression composed, cheeks faintly pale. She told herself she would endure the evening beautifully. She would accept dances politely. She would smile. She would not let anyone see the wound. Lady Ashcombe entered quietly as the maid finished. Eleanor turned. "Mama." Her mother's gaze softened. "You look lovely." "Thank you." A pause. Then Lady Ashcombe said gently, "Mr. Merriweather spoke with your father and me." Eleanor's heart lurched, despite her resolve. "He did?" "Yes," her mother said, and her voice held something careful. "He meant to leave. He dismissed the carriage." Eleanor stared. "Dismissed it?" "He stayed," Lady Ashcombe said simply. "And he spoke. Honourably." Eleanor felt breath catch. What did he say? Lady Ashcombe crossed the room and took her daughter's hands. "He said he will not choose convenience at the cost of truth. He said he will not ask you to accept uncertainty. But he also said," she smiled faintly, "that he is not so indifferent as he pretends." Eleanor swallowed hard. "He is here?" "Yes." For a moment, Eleanor could not speak. Pride warred with hope. She had been hurt. She had been furious. She had been determined never to be foolish, and yet, she realized, she had been foolish already. Not because she cared, but because she had believed caring could not happen to her. The ballroom that night glowed like a jewel. Candlelight multiplied in mirrors. Garlands wound around pillars. Musicians played with bright precision. The guests, in their finery, moved like living colour across polished floors. When Eleanor entered on her father's arm, a murmur ran through the room, not because she was newly admired, but because she was always remarkable. She accepted the first dance from a cousin, the second from a neighbour. She smiled. She spoke lightly. And then, between sets, she saw him. Julian stood near the edge, speaking briefly to Fairfax, his expression intent. When his gaze lifted and met hers, something passed between them, an understanding that felt almost too intimate to exist in public. He approached without haste, without apology, but with purpose. He bowed. "Miss Ashcombe," he said quietly, "may I claim this dance?" Eleanor hesitated only a breath. Then she gave him her hand. As they moved onto the floor, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. They danced in silence at first, the music carrying what words could not. Julian's hand at her waist was steady, respectful. His gaze did not roam. It held her as though he had chosen, fully and irrevocably, to be present. When he finally spoke, it was low enough that no one else could hear. "I wronged you today," he said. Eleanor's chin lifted. "You were leaving." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "Because I thought duty demanded it. And now?" "Now I know duty demanded I stay," he said. "At least long enough to do one thing properly." Eleanor's heart thudded hard against her ribs. "And what is that?" Julian's gaze did not waver. "To speak to your parents before I spoke to you." Eleanor's breath caught. "I have done so," he continued. "I told them everything. My debts, my estate, the expectation of a convenient marriage. I told them I will not pursue it. Eleanor's voice trembled despite her effort. Why? Because I would rather live honestly in a smaller house than comfortably in a false life, Julian said, and something in his expression, so controlled, so raw beneath it, made Eleanor's throat tighten. The dance ended. Couples shifted, the next set forming. Julian did not release her hand at once. I do not ask you to forgive me for leaving, he said quietly. I ask you only to understand why I feared staying. Eleanor swallowed. And why did you fear it? Because if I stayed, he said, I would have to admit what I feel. And if I admitted it, I would have to risk being refused. Eleanor's pride softened, not into weakness, but into clarity. You are not the only one who fears, she whispered. Julian's eyes flickered. I know. They danced again later, and again. In between, Eleanor found herself smiling without effort for the first time that day. Fairfax looked delighted and bewildered. Lady Ashcombe's eyes shone. Near midnight, the final set began. The last waltz before the new year would be greeted. Julian approached Eleanor once more. This dance, he said, if you will allow it. Eleanor placed her hand in his. Her fingers were steady. As they moved, the room seemed to glow brighter, the music more urgent, the moment sharper. Julian spoke softly. You told your guests you would not marry without love. Eleanor's cheeks warmed. I did. And you meant it, he said. Yes. Julian's voice tightened. So did I once, before I stopped believing it was possible. Eleanor looked at him fully. And now? Julian's gaze held hers with quiet intensity. Now I believe it is possible, because of you. But I will not insult you by asking if I cannot do it properly. Eleanor's breath caught. Properly? With your parents' blessing, he said, and with my truth laid bare. The music slowed. The dance ended. People shifted, clapping, laughing, waiting for the midnight toast. Julian did not move away. Instead, he turned with Eleanor toward Lord and Lady Ashcombe. He bowed to them first, in full view of the room. My lord, Lady Ashcombe, he said clearly enough to be heard, I have spoken with you earlier this evening, and I ask now whether I may speak openly before your guests. There was a hush. Lord Ashcombe, stern but not unkind, nodded once. Lady Ashcombe's smile trembled with feeling. Julian turned, then, to Eleanor. He did not drop to a knee. Greymoor was not a stage for theatrics. But he took her hand with reverence, as though the act itself was a vow. Miss Eleanor Ashcombe, he said, voice steady. I came to Greymoor Hall because Captain Fairfax dragged me here when I'd forgotten how to live among people. I intended to endure this house party and leave unchanged. A ripple of amused murmurs. Julian continued unfazed. Instead, I met you, and I found myself unwilling to remain the man who leaves whenever feeling demands courage. Eleanor felt tears sting. Not of weakness, but of sheer, unexpected relief. My estate is troubled, Julian said. I will not pretend otherwise. But I will resolve it honourably, without sacrificing truth for convenience, and with your parents' blessing. He glanced toward them, receiving Lord Ashcombe's grave nod. I ask you now, freely, whether you will become my wife. The hush held. Eleanor looked at him. This man who had nearly left, then turned back. This man who did not flatter, did not perform, did not promise ease. He promised honesty. She had waited for love because she refused to be diminished. And here it was, imperfect, challenging, real. Yes, she said clearly. Yes, I will. For a heartbeat, Julian's composure broke. His eyes closed briefly, as though he had been holding his breath for years. Then applause burst across the room, astonished, delighted, unrestrained. Fairfax whooped like an idiot. Lady Ashcombe pressed a hand to her mouth, tears bright. Lord Ashcombe's sternness softened into unmistakable pride. The musicians struck up a lively tune. Champagne appeared. The clock chimed midnight. Greymoor Hall greeted the new year in laughter and light. And Eleanor Ashcombe, who had refused every suitor because she would not marry without love, began the year engaged to a man who had nearly fled, but chose at last to stay, to ask properly, and to love her with his whole truth. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap the little bell so you are notified the moment the next story is published. Until our next edition, may your days be filled with grace and your nights with the promise of romance.